Okay, let's jump right in. When you hear the word prophet, what comes to mind? Crystal balls, someone gazing into the distant future? Well, actually, let's just toss that idea right out the window. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into Dr. Elaine Phillips's rich historical analysis of the 8th century biblical prophets of the North. And trust me, the historical reality of what these guys actually did is so much more grounded, confrontational, and honestly fascinating than just fortune telling.
We've got a great roadmap for today. We'll start by defining what covenant enforcement mediators are. Then we'll explore Jonah and God's sovereignty, Amos and social justice, Hosea and the wounded lover, and finally we'll look at how these messages echo all the way into the New Testament. Let's get to it.
All right, Section 1, Covenant Enforcement Mediators, basically the policemen of the ancient world.
To really understand this, we first have to ask, what does a prophet actually do? Like I mentioned, we usually picture them passively receiving visions of centuries to come. But the reality is way more hands-on. They were in the trenches, actively engaging with the deeply flawed, messy societies sitting right in front of them. So the crucial takeaway here is that these figures were essentially the policemen of their day. They were called by God, not to tell fortunes, but to step into specific historical circumstances and deal with a disobedient people. Their primary job was to enforce the terms of the covenant. When the people stepped out of line, whether socially, morally, or spiritually, these mediators were deployed to deliver the hard truths and demand they get back to the agreed-upon rules. And you really can't talk about the 8th century without talking about the terrifying elephant in the room, the expanding Assyrian Empire. We have to grasp the sheer geopolitical dread of this era. The Assyrians weren't just casually expanding borders. They used horrific, brutal tactics. We're talking flaying enemies, psychological terror, and literally decimating whole populations. This looming threat was the daily anxiety the northern kingdom of Israel lived under, and it heavily influenced how they reacted to everything these prophets had to say. Moving to Section 2, Jonah and God's sovereignty, the reluctant prophet. So Jonah, he is the classic self-absorbed prophet who famously tries to run in the exact opposite direction of his assignment. And where was he supposed to go? Nineveh, the capital of that terrifying Assyrian empire we just talked about. But the central theme of his whole story is absolute divine control. To prove his sovereignty, God rapidly deploys the elements of nature to redirect his reluctant guy. He conjures a raging storm. He controls the sea, which, remember, to ancient Israelites wasn't just water, it was the abyss, the literal location of terrifying chaos. God uses a great fish not as a punishment, but actually as a rescue from that chaotic deep. Later on, he even commands a little leafy plant to grow and wither. It's like the entire natural world bends to enforce the mission. But we gotta ask, why did Jonah run? His deep internal conflict wasn't just, oh no, I'm scared I'll be killed in a hostile city. His real issue was theological. He was absolutely furious that God would even offer compassion, grace, and a chance for repentance to the brutal Assyrians instead of just wiping them out. He literally says he knew God was gracious and compassionate, and that is exactly why he fled. He absolutely did not want his worst enemies to get any mercy. Next up, Section 3, Amos and Social Justice, the Psychological Trap. Now, Amos was a completely different kind of prophet. He wasn't some polished court insider. He was a blue-collar sheep herder and a tender of sycamore fig trees from the southern kingdom, sent up north to Bethel. And he comes right out of the gate condemning the brutal realities of ancient warfare. Take a look at the threshing sledge we've got pictured here. Normally, a farmer drags this over grain to separate husks, using those heavy basalt stones. But Amos starts condemning the surrounding nations for literal war crimes, like Damascus dragging sledges with iron teeth over the people of Gilead. Just a horrific, visceral image of genocide. And here is where Amos uses a brilliant psychological tactic. He stands up in front of these northern Israelites and starts circling the map, firing off condemnations of their foreign enemies. He calls out Damascus for genocide. He rips into Philistia and Edom for horrific slave trade. He calls out Ammon for extreme violence. You can just imagine his Israelite audience, right? They're nodding along, cheering as this prophet tears into all the terrifying nations around them. He's totally reeling them in, getting them to completely agree that God should judge terrible sins. And then, snap, the trap is sprung. Once he has them cheering for the judgment of their enemies, Amos drops the hammer on Judah and then zeroes right in on Israel itself. He totally exposes their own complacency, their idolatry, and their deep, systemic social injustice. He essentially says, oh, you're cheering about God judging violence and oppression? Great. Take a look in the mirror. He completely calls out the wealthy for crushing the needy and oppressing the poor just to fund their own luxurious lifestyles. Amos completely reverses their favorite self-serving theological expectation. At the time, the Israelites were really longing for this thing called the Day of the Lord. They thought of it as this amazing day of victory, a day when God would show up, wipe out their enemies, and usher them into unparalleled prosperity. But Amos hits them with a massive reality check. He says, "Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord." He warns them that because they are the ones who possess the covenant, they're actually held to a higher standard, meaning the day of judgment is going to start with them. Which brings us to Section 4, Hosea and the Wounded Lover, a life-altering object lesson. So while Amos used these brilliant rhetorical traps, Hosea's actual life, his family, and his greatest heartbreak became his prophetic message to the nation. Prophets use symbolic actions all the time to get the attention of a hardened crowd, but Hosea is forced to live out an agonizing personal tragedy. God commands him to marry a woman of prostitution, Gomer. Why on earth would he do that? To visually and experientially illustrate the spiritual adultery and idolatry of the nation of Israel. The covenant was viewed as a marriage, so by worshiping other gods, the nation was committing flagrant, heartbreaking spiritual infidelity. The emotional weight of these systematically broken commandments is just staggering. Hosea points out that because the people have rejected the knowledge of God, society is literally collapsing. It's not just a private religious issue anymore. It bleeds right into the streets with lying, murder, stealing, and bloodshed following bloodshed. But what makes Hosea so incredibly powerful is how it reveals God's reaction to all of this. It is perfectly mirrored in the relatable, visceral pain of a wounded human lover. There is justified anger, absolutely. There is a profound, ripping hurt that comes from being betrayed by someone you are intimately bound to. There's a totally natural desire to punish. But stunningly, overarching all of it is a willingness to keep loving in spite of it all. God commands Hosea to go and buy his unfaithful wife back, beautifully symbolizing God's relentless pursuit of his people, even in the middle of their deepest brokenness.
And finally, Section 5, Echoes in the New Testament, Timeless Relevance.
Because these ancient messages didn't just fade away when the Assyrian Empire finally fell. They echoed directly into the New Testament. Take Jonah, for example. Jesus, whose own hometown was actually just down the road from Jonah's historical hometown, drew profound structural parallels to the prophet. He told a hardened generation that the only sign they'd get was the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, which was his rescue from the chaotic abyss, Jesus would spend 3 days in the heart of the earth. But for Jesus, after enduring the full wrath of the cross, the grave was actually a rest before his resurrection.
Furthermore, we see Amos's words echoing in a critical, paradigm-shifting moment for the early church. At the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, James actually stands up and quotes Amos's prophecy about restoring David's fallen tent. He used this specific ancient text to justify an incredible decision, the inclusion of Gentiles, the outside nations, into the covenant community. Amos's words literally became the theological bedrock for opening the doors to everyone. Which brings us to a close. When we look around at the social injustice, the complacency, and the personal betrayals of our own modern world, we really have to ask ourselves what these ancient mediators are still trying to tell us. They weren't just scolding bad people thousands of years ago. They hold up a mirror to human nature across the centuries. If the warnings of these ancient covenant cops are still echoing today, are we finally ready to listen? Think about that as we wrap up this explainer. Thanks so much for learning with me, and stay curious.